Today, I'm going to take a look at the updated version of an amplifier that I owned 5 years ago, the ROTEL RMB-1585 Mark II. This is the ROTEL RMB-1585 Mark II. It's the updated version from the Mark I that I reviewed in 2019. The Mark II gets component and circuit upgrades to the power supply and the amplifier stages. The Mark I was capable of 200 watts by 5 all channels driven, while the Mark II gets an increase of 210 watts per channel all channels driven at 8 ohms or 340 watts all channels at 4 ohms. The Mark II gets the ability to bi-amp using input 1 by outputting using channels 1 and 2, while input 5 will output using channels 4 and 5. This feature will let you power the tweeters and the bass drivers independently with compatible speakers. Being a 5-channel amplifier, there are both RCA and XLR inputs. There's a trigger input and output as well as a fan control switch. On all 4 corners are bumpers which will let you stand the amplifier upright while keeping the binding posts from pushing into the enclosure. This is a very heavy Class AB amplifier weighing 82 pounds, so get a helper or have a back brace handy because it's heavy. It measures 17 inches wide by 9.4 inches in height by 18 inches deep. By removing the side panel screws, you can rack mount the amplifier using the included rack mounts. Design-wise, this looks to be exactly the same as the Mark I that I personally quite like. It's got a brushed aluminum fascia with ROTEL's slotted design, which will let airflow into the front, while the exhaust fans will expel air from the bottom. This should keep the amplifier from overheating. Now, this amplifier was sent to me by ROTEL for this review, so thank you guys. Full disclaimer, I don't have a perfect memory, so I can't tell you if the 1585 Mark I sounds any different than this one, the Mark II. I've got the ROTEL hooked up in my theater to power 5 lower channel RBH661 speakers for a 5.0 setup. It's hooked up to a Trinnov Altitude processor, and a Zidu and Kaleidoscape players were used for demos. First thing we're going to check out is Midway. This movie has an ATMOS mix, but we're going to listen to it in 5 channels full range with no subwoofers. That'll put the most work on this amplifier.
The Navy ain't going to pay you for that.
Alright, so the speakers that I've got are definitely not going to be the ideal speakers to run full range since they are very limited in bass response, so they aren't going to tax the amp whatsoever. Aside from that, the planes panning front to back were clearly separated with the same tonal balance panning between speakers, and the center channel dialogue carried the same weight and sounded as clean as my reference Trinnov amps. The major difference I was able to hear between these 2 amps was the noise floor on the Trinnov amps, since they are gain matched with the processor, is dead silent. If you put your ear up to the tweeter with the ROTEL, there is a very faint hiss you can hear. It's not something you'll hear if you're not right up against the tweeter, and you won't hear it while playing content. But other than that, in my dedicated theater, the ROTEL had no issues pushing my speakers to ear bleeding levels, so there is plenty of headroom for my setup. Now, since my home theater relies heavily on subwoofers, I've moved the ROTEL over to my living room system to power up my Per-Listen R5T towers. This will give me a better idea of how well the ROTEL can push more demanding speakers, and also give me an idea of its sound signature. My normal setup in this room is powered by a Sony AZ7000ES receiver, which is their flagship model. Comparing the Sony and the ROTEL using the Sony's pre-outs, they can kind of be hard to tell apart at moderate levels. So while listening to the Wicked soundtrack and Taylor Swift's Eras Tour playlist on Qobuz, I don't think I could tell the difference between the two in a blind test, which I think if you're using your receiver for TV watching in your living room where peak dynamics probably isn't a priority, the Sony alone or your AVR alone should be more than fine. It's when pushing up the volume higher is when the soundstage starts to really take off in the ROTEL. Listening to Sympathy for the Devil by the Stones on Qobuz, my room sounded like it got bigger horizontally and depth-wise. So when the piano kicks in at the start of the song, it appeared to come from behind the right speaker with the maracas playing off to the left side of the room in the left speaker. The Sony sounded more forward and tended to collapse on itself the louder that I turned it up. So the ROTEL remained more three-dimensional when pushed. Putting on Wonderwall by Clara, it was evidently clear that the vocal clarity on the ROTEL carried a much more weightier close-to-mic presence. The Sony was thinner, brighter, a little edgier sounding, and also was more forward sounding, almost as if the singer was in front of the speakers, while on the ROTEL, it kept her in the same plane as the speakers, maybe slightly behind. Now, playing something with a lot more bass, I threw on Samo by Vince Staples. I'm sure there's bass down to 20 Hz in this mix, and the ROTEL didn't crack a sweat at block party levels. On the Sony, at the same obscene levels, I felt bass was deeper with the ROTEL, while the weird high-pitched sound effect that's playing in the background in this song kind of folded in with the vocals on the Sony. Those same effects sounded more like they were floating above the speakers on the ROTEL. I think if you had a similar setup like mine with a receiver and you wanted to squeeze a lot more performance out of it to get more life out of it, adding a quality external amplifier is a no-brainer. Keep in mind though that if you have small speakers that maybe aren't all that resolving and bass limited, and you're crossing over all the bass to subwoofers, you might not notice too much of a difference between the receiver's built-in amps and an external one. But in my case, it didn't matter if I was using the Perlissons or the Martin Logan in-walls, it was very clear the improvement the ROTEL had over the Sony's inbuilt amps. Soundstage was bigger, details were cleaner, especially when pushed really loud, and for both my dedicated theater and living room setups, I didn't feel like I was straining the ROTEL at all. The mid-bass had so much more body and presence to the point where, as much as I like my simple AVR receiver setup, it does kind of make me wish I had an external amplifier because now I know how much performance that I'm missing out on. I wish I had a little more spare change. Not that the Sony is a slouch, but the dynamics I got with the ROTEL, I feel like I'm leaving too much on the table. Well anyways, those are my thoughts on the ROTEL RMB-1585 Mark II 5-channel amplifier. If you do want more information on it or you want to pick one up, they are selling for $4,300 at the time of this video. I will leave some links for it down below in this video's description. So what are your thoughts on ROTEL amplifiers? Have you heard any or do you own any? Leave your comments down below and let me know. Thanks for watching, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll catch you in the next video.